As we've discussed, anthropology studies both the biological and cultural aspects of being human. So one of the questions that we need to ask is, where did we get this cultural side of us? Or how did culture evolve? We know that all humans alive today have culture. We all have the same capacity for culture, even though cultures look different from place to place. So where did culture come from in the first place? We might argue that other animals have culture or some elements of culture, but we also have to remember those characteristics that define human culture, as we've discussed before. Culture is learned, culture is shared, culture is dynamic, culture is symbolic, etc. There are a lot of things that go into our definition of human culture. So do we see all of those characteristics in other animals, or do we only see some of them? Even if we do see some of those characteristics of culture in other animals, we can probably still agree that what humans do is much more elaborated than in other species. Humans, we have our phones and clothing and computers and houses and schools. These are all cultural inventions and elements of culture that we just don't see other animals displaying. So in order to understand how it is that humans develop this thing called culture, we need to really understand what it is that that separates us from the rest of the animals. We need to compare ourselves to perhaps our closest relatives to see what we have in common and then what is also unique to just humans. So let's start by positioning ourselves in sort of a family tree. This type of diagram is called a cladogram. It's kind of like a taxonomy, but we use it to show evolutionary relationships of plants or animals. Now we can put any group of animals or plants onto a cladogram, but their relative position to one another shows us how closely they are related. So we're talking about essentially these lines. How far apart these lines are give us an indication of how far apart or how related or unrelated two different groups of animals are. So the shorter the lines between groups, the more closely related they are. And where the lines meet up, like this, where those lines meet, that represents some sort of ancestor in the past. Because you'll see here on the y-axis is time. So up at the top, this is today, and then this is in the deep past as we go down. And then side to side, the x-axis is the evolutionary distance, meaning that the further apart two animals are on this diagram, the more evolutionary distance there is between the two. So we'll use this cladogram to represent the living apes. There are 6 main ape groups alive today. There are the gibbons. Gibbons are smaller apes. They live in Indonesia. They only weigh about 10 to 25 pounds, and they live in one male, one female pairs. So a male and a female will pair up. The females give birth to twins, typically, and then both parents equally take care of the babies together. The next group are orangutans. They also live in Indonesia, but they're much bigger. Males are about twice the size of females, and they live in these very spread out one male, multi-female groups. The next ape group are the gorillas. Gorillas live in Central Africa. Males are twice the size of females, and they also live in one male, multi-female groups. The next group are the bonobos. Sometimes bonobos are called pygmy chimpanzees because they look a lot like the other chimps that we're used to, but they're a bit smaller. They live in Central Africa, and they live in groups where there are lots of males and lots of females together, although females are typically the ones who have a little bit more power or status. So there's sort of a female hierarchy within the bonobo groups. Next we have chimpanzees. They also live in Central Africa, and some chimps live in Western Africa. They're larger than bonobos and a bit more aggressive. And then finally, our last ape group are the humans. Yes, the humans, us. We are apes. And so these are our closest living relatives. Humans today live all over the world, but our ancestors originally all came from Africa. So looking at this diagram now, there's a couple important things to notice. Because cladograms show evolutionary relationships, this is showing us which apes are most closely related to one another. And that's, again, represented by the shortest lines between groups. So what we see here is that bonobos and chimpanzees have the shortest distance between the lines, or the shortest lines connecting them. And that's because bonobos and chimps are the most closely related ape groups on this cladogram. They're sort of like sister species. And the point where those two lines meet, that represents a time in which there were no chimps and no bonobos, but there was some other kind of ape, an ancestor group that split into the two groups that became the chimps on one side and the bonobos on the other. After the chimps and bonobos, the next most closely related group is the humans. And that's because the distance between humans and bonobos, or humans and bonobos and chimps, is shorter than the lines connecting bonobos or chimps to any other group. So while these two are sort of sister species, we're like the first cousins. We are equally related to both chimpanzees and bonobos. It's not that we're closer to one or the other, because the lengths of the lines here is the same between humans and chimps and humans and bonobos. So they're sisters, we're first cousins. The next furthest cousin is the gorilla. After that, the orangutans are like second cousins. And then finally the gibbons, who are, the cousins that, show up at a family reunion. You know their family, but you're not quite sure who kid they are, but they're technically still part of the group. So these are the 6 living ape groups that are alive today. We can split these apes into 2 smaller subdivisions. The lesser apes, which includes the gibbons and animals like the siamangs. We call them lesser apes because they're a lot smaller. And then we have the greater apes, which is basically everyone else. The orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, chimps, and humans. We have a special name for the great apes, and that is the hominids. Hominids are all of the great apes except for gibbons that are of that larger body size. And in addition, it's not only these living groups, but it's all of the species on the evolutionary line leading to these groups. So what's represented up at the top here are just the living apes, but we know that in the past other groups existed. And so those groups sort of exist along these lines, we just don't display them. So there might have been some ape group, well, we know there was some ape group living millions and millions of years ago that was not a gorilla, not a bonobo, not a chimpanzee, not a human, but some sort of ancestor to all of those groups. And so that would be positioned roughly here on the diagram. Okay, so we've got our hominids, and take note that's spelled with an IDS. That's important because there's another word that's very similar to that that's also going to be useful for us. And that is the word hominin. Hominins are everything that's more similar to us than to the rest of the great apes. So this line right here, circled in blue, these are the hominins with an INS. And at the point where the hominin line meets the bonobo and chimp line, we refer to this as our last common ancestor. So this means that at some point in the past, we think it was around 7 million years ago, there was a type of ape living in Africa that wasn't a bonobo, it wasn't a chimp, and it wasn't a human, but it was something similar to all of those groups. And this was sort of a grandfather group that split apart into 2. Part of them started evolving into the ancestor that became bonobos and chimps, and the other part evolved into us, the humans. Okay, so we are the hominins, and as anthropologists, that's what our focus is going to be on here. Over the last approximately 7 million years, there have been many, many hominin species, probably at least 20 different species of hominin. It's possible that this is our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, this group called Sahelanthropus chadensis, and we'll speak more about that in future lectures. But you can see some of the hominin groups that have existed over the past 7 million years. And then here at the very end is Homo sapiens. That's us. So thinking about this long family tree of 7 million years of just hominins, you can see that we're pretty new to the game. Homo sapiens showed up only a couple 100,000 years ago in Africa. So a long evolutionary history, it's just we're the only ones who are alive today. Now, in order to assess this question of how did humans get culture, if we know that what we do is different from what other animals do and different from what other apes do, then we have to sort of imagine that culture is something that has evolved somewhere in that hominin timeline. But before we can assess that, it's important that we compare ourselves to the rest of our primate relatives, because there are some things that we do as humans that seem very special and very important, but they're actually characteristics that we share with the other primates. So humans share features, three really important features with most other primates. These include increased manual dexterity, increased memory capabilities, and altricial young. We'll go through these one by one. So the first, most primates, including humans, have increased manual dexterity, which just means we have really nice fancy hands that we can do a lot of stuff with. You know, we can hold pens and pencils, we can type on our smartphones, we can braid hair, or we can pick little fleas and gnats out of our friend's fur. And if you look at all of these different primate hands, you'll see they've got these nice big thumbs. These are called opposable thumbs because that means that you can take your thumb and touch it to the tip of each of your other fingers. Some people think that opposable thumbs are unique to humans, but they are not. Almost all primates have opposable thumbs, and that's because very, very early on in our primate evolution, back even before there were apes, so we're talking 60 million years ago, our earliest primate ancestors all lived in trees. And having these thumbs that could basically wrap around things and grip things were useful for our little primate ancestors while they were clinging on to tree branches. So our hands definitely have made an impact on our ability to do cultural things. We can make a lot of stuff with our great hands, but it's not unique to just us. The next characteristic is that all primates, and especially humans, have increased memory capabilities. We're really good at remembering stuff, and that's because our brains are really big. And this goes for all primates. Our brains are big relative to our body size. And in particular, this part of the brain called the neocortex is really expanded in humans and other primate brains for their body size. But other primates and apes and then humans have very big brains for our body size. And the neocortex in particular is important because the neocortex is associated with memory and especially with social memory. And so a few years ago, some anthropologists did some looking at sort of these brain size ratios, and they looked at that compared to group size, the number of individuals that all live together in a community or in a society. And what they found is the larger the neocortex relative to body size, the larger the group that these animals form. Because if you're going to live in a society, if you're going to live in a group of other animals, you have to be able to remember interactions with them on a daily basis. You know, if you're a little monkey and you have a piece of fruit that you want to share with a friend, you want to make sure that you are giving it to the monkey that gave fruit to you yesterday and not the monkey that pushed you out of a tree. But you have to be able to remember those individual interactions. The bigger our brains get, the bigger the social groups that we can live in. And living in large social groups is really good for primates. It keeps everyone healthier and safer and, well supplied with food. So it seems as though within our primate evolutionary history, there has been a selection, there's been an advantage for having larger groups, which means that our brains have gotten bigger to support those larger group sizes. The third characteristic that is common to all primates is that we have altricial young. That means that our babies are born sort of helpless. And this is true of all primates. When our babies are born, they can't do anything for themselves. So parents have to feed their babies, they have to carry their babies, they have to protect their babies, they have to keep their babies warm and safe and away from predators or any other danger. If you compare this to animals like goats or horses or deer, those types of animals have what we call precocious young, meaning that as soon as they're born, they can at least, start walking around. They can transport themselves from one place to another. They can get food more or less on their own in that, they can take themselves to their mothers for milk. They can be a part of their own survival. But with primates, that's not the case, and it's because of our big brains. Big brains require a lot of calories to develop. And so when primate females are pregnant, a lot of the calories that they're taking in are put directly into building up their babies' brains. But we all have to essentially give birth to babies before their brains are fully developed. We have to give birth to babies before they're old enough, before they're developed enough to be able to protect themselves or look out for themselves or feed themselves. If you think about a human child, how old would a child have to be to fully take care of itself? I mean, even if you're talking about just basics, that's like a 5-year-old child. There's no way a human could give birth to a 5-year-old child because that brain is just way too big. So what we do is we essentially push out our babies when they're not really ready to come out, before their brains are fully formed. We push them out early because otherwise it would just kill us, the whole process of being pregnant that long and trying to give birth. And then we take care of them during those first few years of life so that their brains continue growing outside of their mother's womb. So we invest a lot in our children, but that's also okay because it's during that early childhood investment that enculturation happens. And enculturation, as you remember, is the process where a child learns his or her culture. And in primates, they also go through a sort of enculturation period where they learn how to become monkeys or apes or whatever it is. So we have a similar sort of childhood process when it comes to baby primates and baby humans. Now, there are a lot of things, though, that humans do that are very different from what other primates do or other apes. So some of the things that make us unique: we cooperate and we share much more than other primates. In this picture here, this is an Amish barn raising. This is when a community of people will come together and essentially build this gigantic barn in the course of a day or 2 days. We're seeing dozens of people all working together toward a common goal. And while other primates do work together, they hunt together, they don't cooperate and share to the same degree as humans. Human women also live past the age of reproduction. So women go through something called menopause, and we don't see menopause in other primates. Menopause is essentially when a woman can no longer have children. She's no longer having a monthly cycle, but she's still alive, and women will live for many decades after menopause when they can no longer have their own children. In primates, we see that they are able to reproduce basically up until the point when they die. Or another way of thinking of that is that primates will die as soon as they are no longer able to reproduce. So it forces us to ask the question, what is so important about life after reproduction or what is so important about human women, perhaps, that keeps us alive even when we can't have babies anymore? Thinking from a purely biological perspective, what every creature needs to do to maintain its species is to have babies. So if you can't have babies anymore, what's the point of being around? Well, the cool thing about humans, because we're so smart, because we've got these big brains, we're great at learning and we're great at sharing, there seems to be a really big advantage in having older individuals in a group who are not actively producing children, but are still able to invest in children. So what we're talking about is grandmothers. There is an advantage to the entire group, there's an advantage to children when grandmothers can invest in their children's children. It makes people healthier, it makes people more successful, and it's one of the ways that our species has evolved. And that's pretty cool. All right, another thing that humans do that's different from other primates, we have concealed ovulation, which means that when human women are ovulating, which is the time when it's possible for a human woman to get pregnant, that ovulation is not obvious to everyone else. So maybe it's easier to think of this in terms of other primates. When other primates are ready to get pregnant, the females essentially advertise that information to the group. And they'll do that in a number of ways, but here we see a picture of a chimpanzee, and she has a genital swelling. So this is just her genitals that have sort of filled up with almost water as a way of signaling to the males in the group, now's the time that I need to get pregnant, right? If I'm going to get pregnant, like, it's got to be right now. So this is a signal to all the males around her. Human women don't do this, though. We don't have these physical symbols or physical signals that we display to let the men know when it's time for us to get pregnant. So why is it that humans conceal their ovulation and primates advertise it? It might have to do with something called mate choice or partner choice. These, primates that advertise their ovulation cycle, they probably don't have a great deal of choice when it comes to who they're going to reproduce with, because any of the males in the group will see this and will make a beeline for this lady. But in humans, because we're able to hide when we are ovulating, it means that we are able to choose who is going to be the father of our children rather than just the biggest guy is the one who's the most successful. Humans also have more elaborate kinship systems. So we recognize not only our mothers, but we also recognize our fathers and our siblings, and we recognize cousins and aunts and uncles and step-parents and half-brothers and godparents, and we don't see that type of family relationship in primate groups. Primates know who their mothers are. Sometimes they know who their siblings are. Sometimes they know who their fathers are, but that's not always very obvious. So we do family in much bigger ways than other primates. And of course, humans get married. We form these social bonds or social contracts with other people as a way of bringing groups together, as a way of building those large families. And we don't see something like that in primates. Even when primates tend to pair up, they don't have this sort of symbolic or formalized institution for establishing those connections. So while there are a lot of things that we share with primates, there's also a lot of stuff that we do that's unique to humans and we don't see in any other group. Now, if we look at chimpanzees and bonobos, who are among our closest living relatives, or who are our closest living relatives, we see that their behavior has a lot of cultural elements. So many chimpanzee groups make and use tools. They crack nuts open with stones, which you can see represented in the top right corner here. They do a practice called termite fishing, where they take small twigs or pieces of grass and they use it to fish bugs or termites or ants out of the ground to eat them. They also build nests in trees, and they'll sometimes build a new nest every night, depending on where they are, but they'll construct these nests or beds to sleep in and keep themselves safe. Chimpanzees also regularly hunt and share meat with one another. So every once in a while, a group of male chimpanzees will go out and they will hunt down little monkeys. They love eating monkey meat, which is what you see in the bottom right-hand corner. This is a behavior that wasn't known about in the early days of chimp studies, but now we know that it's a pretty common practice, and that's definitely their preferred food. Now, when it comes to bonobos, bonobos have a very unique behavioral adaptation that we don't see in other primates. When chimps, when you're looking at a chimpanzee group, sometimes there might be some aggression between individuals. Let's say two chimpanzees are fighting over a piece of monkey meat, or they both want the same piece of fruit, whatever it is. When chimpanzees start to have an altercation, that can end in violence, and that violence can be really extreme. One person or both, or one chimpanzee or both, could become really extremely injured. They might even die as a result of that aggression, but that's not how it works in bonobo groups. Bonobos have gone sort of the opposite direction with how they handle conflict. Rather than fighting, let's say two bonobos both want the same piece of fruit, rather than getting angry about it, rather than becoming violent, those two bonobos will settle the disagreement by just having sex. So rather than putting anyone at risk, those two bonobos will quickly have sex and then walk away from the encounter. The tension is released, everyone is relaxed, everyone is happy. I don't know who actually gets the fruit at that point, but it doesn't seem to matter. They regularly use sex as a way of avoiding aggression and violence. And they do this often in male-male pairs and female-female pairs, where it's more sort of like external touching. Or if it's a female who's upset with someone else's younger child, then the female and the mother of that bonobo individual, they will have sex to resolve tension. So the thing that's interesting about these bonobos is that they are the only other primate beside humans to use sex for something other than reproduction. In all other primate groups, we see that sex only happens for reproduction, but both humans and bonobos use sex for other reasons. So you can see some elements of similarity with both chimpanzees and with bonobos when it comes to human behavior. Now, I've included links to various videos on chimpanzee culture. Take a look at those. They'll also be linked in Blackboard underneath this video. But it's from this point that we can start thinking about where humans have really diverged from the ape groups by thinking about the things that we have in common with our relatives: manual dexterity, increased memory in altricial young, the things that we do that's different, and then also seeing where some of our closer relatives have some starts and bits and pieces of culture. From here, we can move forward to address when it is exactly that our lineage, the hominins, developed this thing